Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 36 of the ITSM crowd. Today we've got an amazing panel of guests to talk about a really interesting topic, which is change management. So this seems to be one of the areas of service management that everybody's got an opinion on, and today our focus is going to be on how change management is evolving in the DevOps world and what the future of change management looks like. So the first thing I'm going to do is ask our panel to introduce themselves. So working from left to right on my screen, Daniel, if you'd like to say hello first.
Morning, everyone, or afternoon. Daniel Breston, Lean ITSM, DevOps, Change Cultural Coach and Advisor. And looking forward to trying to figure out what change is and how to manage it.
Thank you very much. And Rob?
Rob England from New Zealand. I'm fully a DevOps consultant these days. It consumes my whole life, operating with local organisations here in Wellington. Also, a bit of notoriety, of course, as the IT skeptic online. Still plugging away after 11 years with the blog as well.
That's great. Thank you. And John?
I'm John Hall. I'm a Principal Product Manager at BMC in the Remedy team. A big part of my focus recently has been trying to understand how customers in the enterprise space are adapting to DevOps and how it's changing the world of service and ITSM in their organizations as that happens.
Fabulous. Thank you. And Stuart?
I'm Stuart Rance from London in England. I'm a consultant and an author and a trainer. I do IT service management and I do information security management.
Thank you very much. And my name's Claire Agutter. I'm the lead tutor at ITSM Zone, and I'm going to be the host for today's session. If you've got questions that you want to ask our panel, you can pop them onto Twitter. So if you use the hashtag ITSM crowd, we'll pick those up live and we can discuss those during today's session, but we'll also make this available for catch up on YouTube. So the origins of this session were some months ago now, I think, when Stuart, Rob and John were having a bit of a debate on Twitter about what change management is and how it's changed since we started working with practices like DevOps. So I guess it would be useful if we kind of compare old world and new world. So maybe Stuart, if you can give us a bit of the history of change management, and then Rob, you can talk a little bit about how things are changing.
This always works best if you turn the mute off. Sorry about that. So I was involved in service management maybe 15 to 20 years ago, and we did some research and we discovered that more than 80% of the outages and downtime of the types of computers we used at that time was caused by change. There was no question it was true. I've seen the data. I was heavily involved in looking at it. And a lot of organizations introduced quite formal, fairly bureaucratic change management, which involved major change freezes. It involved people having to go through many, many layers of authorization for changes. And do you know what? It worked. We actually really, really unreliable IT services and made them reliable by bringing a level of discipline and making people think really hard and only changing things if they were quite sure that the benefits outweighed the risks. Unfortunately, when we did that, we introduced many layers of bureaucracy and authorization and decision making, because what we didn't recognize was once we brought things under control, we then needed to get much more clever about delegating and spreading out the risk assessment and the decision making, so that we went from a centralized bureaucratic process to a decentralized intelligent process. And that's now happening with the DevOps movement. But there's some resistance from people who don't understand that their goal is not to have a change management process, it's to deliver reliable services.
Perfect, thanks. And then Rob, maybe if you can talk a bit about what you're seeing with your clients on the DevOps side.
Stuart's just done that. No. So
He's very
one of the life is mantras in the DevOps world. It's philosophical, and so one of my favorite ones is that the correct response to mistakes is not controls, it's learning and improvement. And traditionally, as Stuart said, change management has been about introducing controls to try and ensure we prevent mistakes. And that grows and accretes this bureaucracy. So we're trying to move to a world where we say that if we make mistakes, we should embrace those failures and learn from them and create a learning environment where we improve based on what happens in the mistakes rather than controls to stop that happening again. You know, that thing about if it hurts, do it more. You know, practice till it doesn't hurt.
Yeah, it's I can never remember who said it, but I remember someone at a DevOps conference saying that process is scar tissue that organizations build up over time. And that resonated enormously with me, this idea that every time something goes wrong, we add a little bit more and a little bit more, and eventually we end up with something that just isn't fit for purpose. So John and Daniel, let me bring in you both at this point, and maybe you can talk a little bit about what you're seeing with the people that you're working with.
Sure, there's an interesting change going on out there, because one thing I think we need to understand is DevOps has evolved completely separately from ITSM, and it's come from a different culture. There's this really fascinating cultural background to it in the lean movement and in things like the Toyota manufacturing process, and a lot of the emphasis has changed towards individual autonomy and as Rob and Stuart have said, this sort of evolution of processes in response to things that have gone wrong. It means that we're dealing with a whole group of people who have never really engaged with ITSM and are fully, well, their view of ITSM is very heavily colored by some of the bad reputation that ITSM built up for being heavily bureaucratic. You know, they'll talk about change advisory boards at length. It represents the change process. And to be honest, in the past, I have seen that representing the change process. So there is some justification to that view, I guess. You know, there's some historical truth to it. But I think one of the challenges is, even though I think people can see that there are compatibilities between ITSM and DevOps, and even such luminaries as Gene Kim have written extensively of that. You know, Gene Kim, author of the Phoenix Project and one of the real thought leaders in the space. But there's a little bit of a remaining question: why? You know, why? Even if we can bring these things together, even if we can adapt change management in the ITSM world to DevOps, and the two will mesh together, what do we get from that? And I'm not really convinced that ITSM has answered that question as far as the DevOps community is concerned.
Mm-hmm. And Daniel, tell us a little bit about your observations on this.
I remember it being when I was an IT director, and going back to John's statement about and others about the painful cabs, and we created a process looking at, you know, using lean and looking at a value stream map and using some post-it notes like the ones that Rob has so nicely placed behind his head. You know, really trying to figure out what was the flow of this thing called change. And we realized that when we said change, people had a lot of different meanings of it. When I said change, I wanted to talk about getting the advice to start or do something. When other people were talking change, they had change, release, deploy, test, release, deploy, version control, release, deploy, test again, performance test, security test, and now make it go live. That was the entire life cycle. And then there was the last group of people that just, you know, we just automate change. And what did that really mean? So it's this whole, to me, change is fascinating, because that word and getting it right or getting it wrong is paramount to everything that we're going to do in the DevOps, lean, IT service management, agile, whatever movement that you want to call it. The language is important.
So do we, and this is a question to you all, do we accept that we still need change management now?
I don't think everybody accepts it. And I think, well, no, it depends how we define change management, of course. I mean, one of the things about, you know, that's core to DevOps is that automation. and making things reliable. So a typical mature DevOps process will only allow code to get to production if there is a high level of assurance that that code is safe and will work. And so at face value, there's a lot of commonality with the ITSM or the ITIL standard change model. You know, we are confident that this change is following a defined path, and therefore we have a reasonable degree of confidence that it's going to succeed, and we can let that go. But again, I think that message, while it seems appealing, doesn't actually account for the fact that even that defined path continually evolves. I think semantically it's a little bit awkward to say DevOps changes are the same as standard changes, and again, we're not convincing the people doing those automated high maturity DevOps practices that ITSM is bringing any value anyway by getting itself into that process.
Interestingly, I went out to the pub last night with Daniel, who's here, and Ivor McFarlane. Now, Ivor wrote the 2007 edition of ITIL Service Transition, which describes change management, and I wrote the 2011 edition. And we were both bemoaning the fact that people do a load of stuff that they say ITIL says do this, and we never wrote that. And we in fact wrote the exact opposite. So my advice to my customers is have a change advisory board by all means, but if you put more than 3 or 4 things in front of it every month, you're doing something badly wrong. There are times when you do need to discuss with a group of senior management, do we want to proceed with this idea? But it is not, shall we update the firmware on server Gandalf? It's just like, that's bizarre. So for me, what went wrong was people who were too lazy to read a book, who guessed what they thought it meant, and then implemented the most horrendous bureaucratic processes around getting a whole load of managers to sit around a desk once a week and talk about things they knew nothing about. And if only they'd read the bit that said you delegate change authorization as far down as you possibly can based on the nature of the change. So it's not a matter of, shall we make every DevOps change a standard change? It's, for this particular change, who is the right person to assess the risk and make the decision? That might be the paired programmer, it might be the software manager, it might be the person who devised the testing environment. But the point is, it probably isn't a meeting of 14 senior managers. But somebody should do it. Now, typically that somebody should do it should be part of the flow, not a separate thing done at an awkward time to delay everything. And it should be somebody who knows what they're talking about. And if that is the person who wrote the code because it's a code deployment, or if that is the infrastructure manager because it's a firmware update, that's fine. If they're the right person to make, somebody has to assess risk, but that same person has to take responsibility for facilitating the rate of change we need.
But I think that goes back, Stuart, to your point, you know, exactly to the point of the first thing to look at when you're looking at change is the people aspect, which is what we were talking about. And you know, there's a you know a great case of some people I was talking to. They renamed the change management process to trust, the trust process. And what part of that could they automate? And what part of that could they, you know, whatever else ended up, but it was all people collaborating together to create this thing called change.
I think there's another layer to it as well when we distinguish between unicorn DevOps and enterprise DevOps. So, you know, if you're a unicorn, then you know, you're deploying small independent units of code that have high levels of autonomy from other units of code, and you're deploying it through highly automated processes with, you know, built-in quality assurance in the whole mechanism. Whereas if you're an enterprise DevOps, then you're releasing complex legacy code that's spaghettified into infrastructure that's complex and spaghettified, and it's really hard to release stuff independently and autonomously without impacting some other areas. So communication and collaboration and coordination become so much more important in terms of doing change. You can't be autonomous in your change. You have to consult with other dependent areas to make sure that there aren't impacts from other groups who are doing activity at the same time. So, you know, I think that defeats some of the arguments of you know, do away with change. That's the end state. That's the aspirational star. But in the pragmatic world of enterprise DevOps, we still need high levels of change coordination to ensure we're not going to collide, we're not going to go without some dependency.
This is something I think that I completely agree with, having spoken to a lot of enterprise people who are moving into the DevOps world. Systems in enterprises are very complex. As you say, they often have components that are very old. And this is why when I talk about myself about how ITSM as a group of practitioners and practices has the opportunity to bring value, but it has to be sort of carefully considered value, that one of the things that really seems to make a DevOps practitioner in an enterprise sit up and pay attention is saying, we can bring you context on this complexity. So I think ITSM has got a double reputation. I spoke with teams at DevOps Days in Stockholm, and one team said that they took it in turns to be the person in the team that week to click the button in the ITSM system. In other words, they were getting on with their changes. Something was being created in the ITSM system. A button had to be clicked. It was they were joking in a very derisory manner about this process, and rightly so. But another group of people had API access to the CMDB. And you say CMDB at these conferences, and people think, oh, it's another stodgy ITIL buzzword. But when I spoke with them, what they actually had was the ability to bring service dependency information and all that other stuff that ITSM has historically been very, very good at gathering to define and explain and make some, bring some context and a picture of these complex systems. That's incredibly valuable information if, for example, you're an engineer working on a tool like Puppet or Chef, trying to do, to build code that automatically scales up the infrastructure into which changes are being deployed. If we can focus on the things that ITSM is very good at bringing, then there's huge value to be offered to that community.
A couple of extra points to think about. First one is not all change to code. Infrastructure, there's changes to supplier contracts, there's changes to service level agreements, there's changes to all sorts of things, infrastructure, that you need to take into account and plan and manage. Although I do love infrastructure as code, which gets rid of some of that. But as Rob said, we do have a huge amount of technical debt that we have to manage, and those systems with loads of technical debt need care and love and attention. I just think we need to make sure, one of the things I've seen over the years with legacy change management is that although people get involved in the decision making, it's interesting that the people who make the decision are never accountable for it. You never see the senior manager who said, yes, proceed with the change, get the blame when the change goes wrong. And I find that interesting. The idea of power without accountability strikes me as broken as a process. Wouldn't it be good if we measured the success of change and we gated people's right to authorize change based on how good they were at assessing it? I have seen one organization do that, where in principle, if people assessed the change as low risk, they were allowed to authorize it themselves, unless one of their changes had failed in the last 12 months. What's interesting is it focused the mind. Nobody would have authorized their own change if they were worried about it failing, because they didn't want to lose the right to authorize their own changes. So, we can do a lot of quite clever stuff to help people focus. It's not a matter of getting rid of change authorization. It's a matter of putting it in the right place and making people accountable and take responsibility for the decisions they make.
And I think there's maybe a scope question here as well, as in what do we consider to be within the scope of change management? So, for example, if we look at automated delivery pipelines, that's a technical decision about a go, no go for a particular change. But at that point, work has already been done. And when I was a change manager going back kind of 10 years ago, we were looking at things before any work had been done as well, and looking at things from the perspective of, well, what's the business benefit of doing this? Do we want to actually dedicate any resources to this? And then follow that process through to the point where we said, okay, this code passes and can go into the live environment or not. So I think maybe there's a question about the scope of change management, and it's not just, do the things that we've produced work? It's also, are we producing the right things?
I think that gets very confused in terms of whether we're doing business portfolio change management or project change or operational deployment change, and they do get muddied in discussions, and it's good to unpeel those things. But I think in an agile world, with the way that we iterate, a lot of that stuff becomes baked into the process. So we might be doing longer cadence planning, like dare I say it, safe, and safe word, something on a longer, like a quarterly cadence, where we're planning, at a broad level what we're going to do, and that's being driven by business portfolio planning, which is being done at that value level, to then drive our longer cadence, to then drive our decision making in a sprint. And if a product owner in the business in a sprint says build that, then you don't have to go back to them a week later and say, remember that thing you said I should build a week ago, I built it, shall I deploy it? I mean, the decisions are made in the planning in advance by the business, and the only reason we've built mechanisms in to go back to the business to say, hey, remember that thing that you told us to build, shall we deploy it, is because in traditional waterfall they asked for it 18 months ago. And we come back and we go, ta-da, and they're like, oh yeah, that's right, we asked for it. and that whole cycle was broken. But now they're deciding a quarter, a month, a week ahead of time, do that thing.
There are some things around release management and change management which aren't just this deployment of code. And I worry that we keep coming back to talking about we wrote some code and deployed it. So I've seen numerous cases where people have deployed all sorts of Internet of Things devices connected to their network, and then when all the light bulbs mount a denial of service attack on the web server, they act surprised because nobody had thought about the risks of deploying these light bulbs that were all in. There's a lot of stuff beyond code, and it worries me that we keep going back to the code pipeline. If you've got people in your building putting in internet-enabled devices that are capable of launching an attack on your own infrastructure from inside, and nobody's thinking about it from a risk as well as a benefits point of view, that's an issue. And it's a change management issue.
One of my favorite, or should I say least favorite statements about DevOps almost just described it as basically being mature ITIL release management. And fundamental problems with that, but one of them is the fact that it kind of assumes that code appears in a vacuum, and then change is all about deploying it. And again, this is an area where I think business context and service context is very, very valuable information to people in these DevOps teams, because the reality is they are working towards defined benefits. They're meant to be delivering new code. At the same time, increasingly, these applications in the enterprise are out there in front of real customers. And those customers, no matter how reliable your deployment process is, those customers will still be finding issues, even if it's down to their own knowledge. There'll be issues in that tool. So now these teams have got changes they're meant to be implementing in the code. They've got longer term objectives, and now they've got 50 tickets in the queue. And one of the issues I see with context is that they're not, whereas ITSM probably 15, 20 years ago solved all issues on post-it notes problem by professionalizing and hardening the customer service angle, that hasn't necessarily penetrated into this process yet. Some of those issues they're getting come from external customer service systems. Some of them come from event handling and monitoring, so they're being swamped with events. Does that sound familiar? And again, this is where I think, whereas ITSM has been fixated a little bit, in my opinion, on how do we make DevOps compatible with ITIL change management, and hey, it will fit together, so we should just do that. That's not where we're adding value. We're adding value if we bring sufficient business context to help people prioritize what they can do. If we make this change, which other services are dependent on it, which people are going to scream if we don't fix this problem. These are solved problems in ITSM, and we can bring that information to DevOps and richly improve their way of doing change, in my view. We shouldn't necessarily feel that ITSM is going to add a lot to the continuous delivery pipeline, which has been evolving separately in a very successful way.
I agree with that, John. Just one other example to reinforce the value that IT service management can bring in this. There are frequent security patches to all sorts of things, whether it's OpenSSL or a Microsoft operating system. Every time we hear about another security breach, it turns out that patches weren't up to date. Why? Because nobody's looking at release management of security patches. So there's no point in each individual delivery pipeline taking responsibility if some old legacy system that hasn't been changed for 14 years is still running unpatched in the background, because nobody's saying, when we release this, where are all of the potential targets? How do we use our configuration management database potentially to find everything we've got running this version of this operating system? There are some things that still need an IT service management approach rather than a delivery pipeline approach.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And again, it comes back to Rob's point about the difference between the unicorns and the enterprises. Some of the unicorns don't have this enormous legacy bloat that they're dragging along behind them, but in an enterprise we tend to, and you know, change management can help us address all of that. I think maybe just a kind of a real life example. So I was in an auto trader yesterday talking to them, and they were telling me that they've changed their change advisory board. Used to be 3 hours every week going through every single RFC, and now the change advisory board is managing changes on a Trello board, which is fabulous. I love that. And the change advisory board is 5 minutes a week, and what it's looking at doing is where you have changes that cross multiple squads, as they call them, but changes that, you know, maybe need a bit of support between teams. That's what the change advisory board delivers, is that bit of assurance and that bit of discussion between teams. And the thing that interested me was, I said to them, I'm surprised you still call it a change advisory board, because it seems the role has evolved a bit beyond that. And they said to me that they still get audited by, you know, the Deloittes, the PwCs, and change advisory board was still something that the auditors like to see. It's still something that they feel comfortable if they know that that's happening. So as a company that's been on a real digital transformation journey, I thought that was quite a nice story. So we're coming up to the end of our time now, and we always like to finish the ITSM crowd with a little top tip or a piece of advice from each of our panel. So if we just quickly go through everybody, Daniel, what's your top change management tip for an organisation today?
Agree what the word means and be flexible as you build it. Don't ever let it get into dry concrete. Keep it very wet.
Sounds good. And John?
I think we need to remember that the DevOps community has evolved differently to ITSM. It comes from lean culture, and a whole aspect of that culture is cutting out things which are not adding value. Whatever ITSM does to try and work with DevOps has to be demonstrably adding value, or they will reject it.
That seems like a good thing to remember. And Rob?
Helps if you're on mute, doesn't it? Yeah. Shift left, shift left, so that change becomes a formal. What we would call traditional change management is a formality. That all the quality is in the system anyway. We don't need the controls at the end. And a second top tip is that Post-it now make a super sticky Post-it note, and you should never buy anything else.
That's good. I do know one company that abandoned Kanban because every time somebody slammed the door, all the Post-its fell off the wall. So that's good to know. And Stuart, your top tip for people?
Oh, Rob's just said it for me. Shift left. In other words, categorize your changes of change, delegate as low as possible down the organization the right to authorize that change.
Fabulous. Thank you so much to all of our panel members. Thank you to Daniel, John, Rob and Stuart. That's been a really enlightening discussion, and I think for organisations that are doing traditional change management, and maybe for organisations in the DevOps world as well, that there's some things to think about there about how we all make sure that we're doing the right things and doing them right as well. So thank you very much to our panel. I will see everybody on the next episode of the ITSM Crowd. Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Claire. Bye.
Bye.